My name is Peter Pudney. I'm an Associate Professor of Industrial and Applied Mathematics at the University of South Australia. One of my projects with the CRC for Low Carbon Living was to do with the diversity of demand, electricity demand in low energy housing. We looked at two low energy housing communities, one at Lockhill Park and one here at Bowden. At Lockhill Park we had 100 houses that we were monitoring, and here we had an apartment building with 42 apartments. A normal house will use up to 15 kilowatts of power before it blows a fuse or throws a circuit breaker. And if you have 100 houses, each of them using 15 kilowatts, then that's 1,500 kilowatts of power. But you don't need to plan for that much because not everybody is using power at the same time. So what we looked at is how much does a community use and what's the peak power use of a community of 100 homes or 42 apartments. When SA Power Networks plans the electrical installation for a suburb, they assume that each house will use somewhere between 4 and 10 kilowatts of power. And that's usually enough to make sure that everyone can get power when they need it. But we wanted to know how much these low energy houses were using. The SA Power Network standard is based on the floor area of the building, and so larger houses are allowed a greater power allowance. What we found is that if you divide the total power of the suburb or the development by the number of houses, then the actual peak was much less than allowed for by SA Power Networks in their technical standards. What we found was that at Lockhill Park, houses were using 3 kilowatts peak rather than the 6 allowed for. And here at Bowden, the apartments were using 1.2 kilowatts instead of the 4 kilowatts allowed for in the standards. So what this means is that with low energy housing, when you're putting in a new development, you don't need to put in as much electrical infrastructure as the current standards would say you have to. This has been useful for our partner Renewal SA in their negotiations with the electrical energy providers to make sure that they're not paying for too much infrastructure. I'd like to thank Renewal SA and Andrew Bishop for their help in finding apartments and houses that we can use, and for the residents who allowed us to look into their energy use to determine how much power they were using.